Okay, we're calling the series a Make a Difference series, and we've had somebody's talk about universal basic income before, and um, we
Okay.
hope to cover many other interesting themes in the future, but today we're very happy to have Ellen speaking to us because, as you all know, she's been part of Birch Street for a long time, but you might not know she has a master's in botany from U of T and has been part of the Toronto Field Naturalists and spent 30 years with the public service working in the environmental field. And
I'm really happy to be here with our congregations. I know there's lots of interest in nature in our communities, and I know St. Matt's, for example, has your healing garden, which is a terrific addition to the local landscape, and I'll be talking about that sort of initiative as it's spread right across the province, right across the city, really. So what I really want to let ourselves think about today is the tensions that we all know about when we're living in Toronto. We know that it's a rapidly growing city, and we know that we have a lot of needs as members of the community, including a need for nature nearby. I want to sketch out why urban nature matters, also from a climate perspective. And I want to sort of share some inspiring examples in the Toronto area of restoration, nature restoration that's already happened, it's underway, and the kinds of opportunities that we don't want to let slip out from our grasp. So that's essentially what we'll be doing today. A little bit about the Toronto Field Naturalists, and I'm representing them here today. So what we've done for almost 100 years now is we've offered guided walks by volunteers, about 10 a month. So that's quite a range of walks all over the city. This happens to be a walk that I'm leading with the U of T students last year. But our walks are to all kinds of audiences, and often with our own members. And we make sure that our walks are available all through the seasons, because of course nature is not just there in the summer, and our winters are a long time and are often especially beautiful, and we especially need that connection with nature in the winter. So all season connection is really important. Other things our volunteers do is we help in the ravines in partnership with the City of Toronto to control invasive plants like Phragmites, and like many groups in the Toronto area, we help clean up ravines. It's a sort of a satisfying thing to do. And we also speak up for nature at City Hall, and so advocacy really takes up as many hours as you have time, because there are so many issues going on in the city. So advocacy is another big role. And what I think I'll be doing as well during this talk is including shout outs to other nature groups. You'll see that there's really quite a rich ecosystem of communities, of nature communities in the city. So it's by no means just the Toronto Field Naturalists that are active. What we all know, it's absolutely obvious, is the speed with which our city is growing. It's the fastest growing city in North America, and it's a place that people from all over the world want to come to. Pre-pandemic, we had about 130,000 people entering the GTA in a given year. And longer term, we're expecting the city to grow again very, very rapidly. And people come, they're coming from all over the world. They are very often moving into high rises. So it's not that they have access themselves to cottages, or that they're even familiar with the nature that Toronto has to offer. And so that's also part of this growing, shifting dynamic, that people need that access, but can't necessarily find it, and certainly don't have it in their backyards. So in the face of that incredible growth and that that tension of more people needing places to live in the city, I'm going to make the case for more nature in Toronto. As a naturalist, it's sort of natural that I would do that. And I'm going to be giving you a sense of the many benefits that we can get from nature nearby. Not only from a climate perspective, but also from a human perspective. So I think what we want to think about for a minute is reflect on where we are here. And we're on the shore, the northern shore of a great lake, and real estate agents would say, well, location, location, location. And Indigenous peoples would say that we're standing on sacred land. And we know that for thousands of years, this has been a land where people have hunted, they have grown crops, they have tended trees, they have fished in the rivers. It's been many, many groups. And most recently, it's been the Mississauga of the Credit, which are the current treaty holders. And it's their flag that flies today at Ward's Island, which has been a very ancient site of healing. And so we know that the land has been important and a very generous land for a really long time. We know that the name Toronto comes from the Mohawk and evokes this idea of wetlands, of water where trees are standing. So we know that the marshes where that would have been brimming with all kinds of fish and American eel, a really important food staple, a place to hunt and trap muskrats. Those wetlands were really key to Toronto. And as well, something else that made Toronto a especially rich ecosystem was the fact that the rivers all flowed from these highlands up here, the green belt, the so embattled green belt, and the ancient gravel deposits that are there from the last ice age. These gravel deposits are really what feed our rivers, and that's what gives us that reliance on clear, cold water that feed the Humber, the Don, and in the east, the Rouge River. And so if we zoom in a little bit, we see that these are also the areas where we have that green space. So you imagine from a bird's eye view, and I'm going to be taking a bird's eye view a number of times here, that this is really what attracts migratory birds. As they arrive on the north shore of Lake Ontario, they have really, since the last ice age, had the opportunity to fly through these corridors and fly north to their breeding grounds. So that's another angle to why this land is so special and has such rich biodiversity. Another way to look at it is that we are on the very northern edge of the Carolinian zone. And the Carolinian zone is a zone that really covers much of eastern North America. And as the name implies, right down to the Carolinas. And it's a zone where you are able to grow much more tropical kinds of trees grow. And it means that in Toronto, we're able to grow pawpaws, sassafras, tulip trees, things that just north of here would no longer be able to survive the winters. So that's a special feature that we have that moderated climate thanks to the Great Lakes. And if you'd asked an ecologist might have said, well, it might not be an especially good place to put a huge metropolis right there on the northern edge of the Carolinian zone. But human beings have always chosen rich and generous places to live. That's a human trait. And so we have that tension. And again, a good lens through which to look at Toronto's biodiversity is through our incredible bird biodiversity. Toronto's migratory birds, again, and especially the warblers, give us a sense of what this land has been traditionally. So a couple of dozen different species of warblers, and warblers many of them migrate great distances. They really are integrators between the northern and southern hemisphere. Some of them come from as far away as the Andes and fly up into the boreal forest. And so they take these incredible migratory journeys a couple of times a year. The blackpoll warbler, for example, which you'll sometimes see in Toronto, will fly up to 3 days nonstop. Tiny birds that are able to carry out these extraordinary feats of endurance. And so Toronto has almost 370 bird species that have been documented here. And many of those actually spend their whole life cycle here. Again, others flow through, and for them as a stopover and a refueling site, Toronto is absolutely vital. And we also have close to 40 bird species that are considered at risk under law. And again, that gives you a sense of the kind of rich habitat that still remains here, despite the fact that we have such a dense city. And this gives you a sense of the migratory flyways, which again, they have been here since the last ice age, and the birds have of course followed the receding glaciers north and have migrated further and further north. And you can see that Toronto really is at the intersection of these flyways, meaning that there are twice a year on the order of millions, if not billions of birds flying overhead, often in the dark, and we're quite unaware of it. And again, a sense of the marshes that used to coat or rim the north shore of Lake Ontario. Ashbridges Bay was really one of the largest wetlands, and it was filled in over 100 years ago because it had become extremely polluted and was affiliated with cholera outbreaks. But bit by bit, we are returning tiny bits of these wetlands to the region, and they're absolutely vital. This gives you a sense of the remaining environmentally significant areas in Toronto, and you can see that there's on the order of 90 of them that the city mapped out about a decade ago. And so they are spots on a map, and you'll see that many of them track along the ravines and along the shorelines, especially the Toronto Island and the Leslie Street Spit here. But also along the ravines and shorelines. And so these are areas that, because they're so-called ESAs, you cannot build right on top of them, but they really are not protected from the everyday rough and tumble of a big city. They aren't protected from infrastructure that is often zoned or allowed to go right through ravines. And I mean, the absolutely vital infrastructure that we all depend on, the transit, the sewers, the power lines, they tend to go through the ravines. And so that's another impact on these environmentally significant areas. And it's another one of those areas of tension that really have not been resolved. But we know that we do have a responsibility to maintain these areas. They are the remnant bits, and this fall flowering, the September fringe gentian on Ward's Island is just one example of a small habitat that's been there for hundreds of years, so many centuries, in those very dynamic meadows and dunes along Ward's Island. And so I think if we have a vision of Toronto, something that we want to hand on to future generations, it shouldn't just be a sort of a museum of bits and pieces, but something that is vibrant and that thrives for the future. And that should really include plants like the fringe gentian and other many other plants that you can still find in the Toronto area. The climate connection I had mentioned, and like any major city, Toronto has ambitions and a responsibility to curb its climate impacts. And we know that the heavy lifting that we need to do as a city is, of course, that we need to really dramatically cut back on the energy uses of our buildings, so greater energy efficiency for buildings, but also how we get around. So our transportation really needs to change dramatically, less car driving, more public transit. But we also can look at what our urban nature is doing in terms of mopping up and absorbing some of that carbon. And there have been estimates done of what Toronto's urban forest contributes, and an estimate that it's about $4 million worth of carbon storage a year. So that's not bad. It's probably on the margins, but it's something to consider. I'd say that what is more impactful, very likely, is how an intact and healthy natural environment in an urban setting can help us change our behaviors, and so that we don't feel obliged to escape to another hemisphere for a nature break, but we can actually do it in High Park or in one of the ravines, so that as we make those shifts in our behaviors, the city's healthy nearby nature has to be part of that solution. And again, in winter as well. So these would really be ways to reduce our individual carbon footprints. As well, of course, we know that climate change is upon us, and like cities all over the world, we are seeing flooding events. This happens to be one that happened in Finch Avenue in 2005, the so-called Finch Avenue washout. And cost on the order of $500 million of insured damage. Some of you may remember more recently the flooding of the Don Valley, which left many GO Transit users really stranded for hours at a time. And so we know that without the ravines, without the forest lands that we have in our urban areas, these sorts of flooding events would be far, far worse. So the activity of ravine and forest lands to be sponges, to hold back the floodwaters in these extreme events is invaluable. And we know that these sorts of floods will continue. You've got a largely paved over landscape, and it's inevitable that we will see these kinds of things, and gray infrastructure will only take you so far to manage it. This is really one of the big challenges, again, to understand that our individual carbon footprints are tied to where we live in an urban environment. And this is a map of the Toronto area. And so if you take a look here, so this is the white area here is the lake down here, and this is the sort of the core part of the city. And you can see that the per person carbon footprint is lower, in other words, green, in the urban core, because people are able to use public transit on average. They on average have smaller residences, so there's less space heating. And if you're going to live out in the suburbs, your per carbon footprint is on average going to be higher. So this is true not only in Toronto, but in every urban center. So we understand that the future of a sustainable globe really is that we build our cities up, we build them densely, and yet we also need nature. So that's that's the circle that we want to square, and that I think we can. We know that nature and mental health are linked. Those of us who weren't aware of that yet, certainly the pandemic brought it home. But public health units all over the world have been researching and confirming this. The City of Toronto's public health unit did a study in 2015 and confirmed what everybody is understanding, that green space is really important for population mental health and physical health, and that green space needs to be well maintained and cared for in order to get those benefits, those health benefits. So from a climate change perspective and from a public health perspective, green space in the city is vital. And we could just say it's priceless, but of course people love to put a price on things. And so the city and Toronto Region Conservation Authority a few years ago did that estimate putting sort of costing estimates on the value of the ravine systems, especially in terms of recreation. And they came up with a quite considerable value of 822 million a year in terms of recreational benefits. And so that doesn't really even include those hard hat civic engineering services of water quality and water quantity management. In the face of all that, we keep repeating that, drumroll, Toronto is growing fast, and the city's chief, the manager of parks, has been sounding alarm bells since pre-pandemic, saying, politicians, mayor, people, we can't keep up. We are not able to add parkland at the speed of population growth, and that is a real challenge. And we know in the pandemic, we saw people in great numbers escaping to any local green space. In the height of the pandemic, we had our ferries crammed full of people needing to get to Toronto Island, which even pre-COVID was getting 1.5 million visitors a year. Again, in 2021, park manager again sounded the alarm in the budget consultations that we're getting a declining provision of parkland per person over time. People need the parks for, so office users, office workers are going into the parks for meetings, classrooms are being held in parks. So the needs have become greater than ever before. And I think what we want to do here is step back, take a deep breath, and realize that we have been doing some terrific work in the city over decades in bringing new nature to the city. And the Leslie Street Spit is just one example, a very good one. So in the 1970s, there was this thinking that the city needed new portlands, that its growing port industry would need those lands. So a great deal of lake fill happened here. But it transpired pretty quickly that Toronto's future was not in Portland industries. And then these lands would have become golf courses, private marinas, sailing clubs, parking lots. That was all in the cards had it not been for very effective and persistent nature advocates who said that this is an incredible opportunity to add natural parkland open to all to the Toronto's waterfront. And they were relentless. And as a long-term result, we now have Tommy Thompson Park, over 500 hectares of terrific wilderness, you could say, urban wilderness, an incredible draw for those migratory birds, for shorebirds. And really, if you're interested and want to know more, I can recommend this terrific book, Accidental Wilderness. There was nothing accidental about it. It only took decades of advocacy to ensure that this remained a natural area open to all. Another example here really that we all are aware of is the Evergreen Brickworks, which of course for many generations was a brick factory in the Don Valley and supplied bricks for much of Toronto, including the house where I live now. And it was the source of employment for hundreds of men. And really hard work, and eventually the site was worked out and no longer economical and was abandoned in the 80s. And really the city was left with an incredible dilemma. What do you do with this enormous hole and these abandoned buildings? And it took the inspired vision of city planners, of philanthropists, of the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and many advocacy groups to say that really we should restore this to a natural area, and again, to make it a public space. And we now have an extraordinary wetland where we have beavers and kingfishers, and we have snapping turtles. And so it's all seasons place that is accessible as well, so wheelchair accessible. So really a wonderful success and something to be inspired by. Corktown Common, maybe fewer people are aware of Corktown Common, but think of it as being just east of the Distillery District. And it's a more recent development, maybe in the last decade or so. And again, this was an area that had a very, very long tradition of of industrial activity, and has now incorporated a very important flood control feature, and a great focus on nature and native species, so entirely native planted, and a lot of dense housing as well. And so this was the site of much of Toronto's pork processing. So up to 500,000 hogs were processed here for many years, and all the associated industries with tanneries, and you can imagine the kind of contamination that happened on these lands. So people really, in the end, walked away from the land, wringing their hands, not knowing what to do with it. So it was really only in the last couple of decades, with the Pan Am Games being the impetus to restore this area. And so it's now been planted with over 700 trees, again, a focus all on native plants, and the city is now managing this site with a tiny little wetland, a really lovely space. Birds are rediscovering this site, and as well, you've got over 6,000 residential units, really cheek by jowl. And the nice thing here again is that it's also accessible, wheelchair accessible as a park, and that local community, the local buildings are also focused on accessible housing. So it's really a success story in that way as well. Now, if you are going to put nature and buildings so in such close proximity, it's really important that you focus on bird safe design, so that you use the fritted windows, for example, that birds are able to see. And we have a nonprofit group called FLAP that has for many years drawn attention to the challenges that birds experience when they've been flying for thousands of years across this landscape, and suddenly a city has come up, and the death toll for migratory birds is horrendous. So they've been taking that message to Queen's Park through rallies, and the City of Toronto does have green standards that dictate bird-friendly design for large developments, but it's still voluntary for smaller buildings. And that's something that we'll need to take on board over time. And I think one of the things FLAP wants people to remember is that the spring migration, and even more the fall migration, are times that are particularly challenging for migratory birds, because their volunteers find very large numbers of dead birds around high rises at that time. So again, we keep coming back to this pressure of the need for housing, and we all understand how urgent it is. And it's not just the housing, of course, it's also the power and the sewers and the all the infrastructure that's needed to keep our houses, our homes running. And we know the pace needs to pick up dramatically. Every month brings a new report. And so it's the space that we need, not just for the buildings, but also for this, for all the necessary add-ons, the sewers and the pipelines. And you would think, well, that's even more of a challenge, but in fact, there are opportunities here to work with the infrastructure. And if you've got agencies that are willing to listen and are willing to collaborate, you can have beautiful things happen. And one example would be the collaboration that has happened with Hydro One, the agency that manages the long-term transmission corridors. And the Meadoway is something that has transformed these really dull, long corridors of lawn that gets mowed repeatedly every season into pollinator paradises. And so that's been happening in Scarborough, and we have almost 16 kilometers that have been completed at this point. So that's a really wonderful development. And again, it's because the various agencies have been able to collaborate and listen to each other. Areas where we have the opportunity to do more and to be creative. I think that many in the nature community and in the urban community gardens communities have all looked at the issue of golf courses and have seen opportunities. So these are particularly the city's own sort of taxpayer-owned golf courses. And we have 5 at least that are owned by the city and have been dedicated to really available only to golfers for the past 60 years. And they have all been in the valley lands along the ravines and the rivers. And it's a sort of a single use that might have been okay 60 years ago when the city was smaller and the pressures were less intense. But given the current situation, a lot of people are saying that it's time to change this. It's time to transform these publicly owned golf courses to make them open to all. And so here's where these golf courses are distributed all over the city. Some of them are right along subway lines, so they would be ideal for public access. And there's been a consultation in the last couple of years about this. There was an alliance. The Toronto Field Naturalists was part of an alliance that spoke about the need to open up these lands to many different uses, including food growing, including a focus on food sovereignty for BIPOC communities, and also naturalizing the bottomlands, the areas that would be perpetually wet and natural wetlands. Unfortunately, at this stage, the golf community has been very well organized and very vocal, and council decided that they would just leave things as status quo. So I think that that's a temporary setback, but I think that the time is really ripe to change this as no longer a status quo that we should have in Toronto. Ontario Place is another area that has been, much in the public view, and there is public domain land along Ontario Place that was designed by Michael Huff Landscape Architects and others as natural, and there's a strong urge by the public that it remain natural and that nature on the waterfront be restored. And there's another consultation happening now. I mean, there was one in April of this year, but there's another one that is open right now. But following that, I'm definitely seeing that the requests for more nature on the waterfront are very, very strong. In the tiniest patches all over the city, there are opportunities to add nature, whether it's on a high-rise balcony or in people's private front yards. Community gardens like the one that St. Matt's has, they can all be part of the solution. The TTC has a modest partnership with the nonprofit group LEAF, and the TTC, of course, like many agencies, has these innumerable sort of neglected spots of property that they didn't really know what to do with. This one is just a stone's throw away from Bloor Street United Church. And this is what it looked like in 2010. But thanks to LEAF and a whole team of volunteers that has been managing this site, it's been restored to be a tiny oasis of native plants. And so those sorts of activities are going on quietly all over the city. And what they do need, though, is they need the support of designers and they need basics like outdoor water taps that are accessible, like tool sheds and protection from traffic. So those sorts of really modest requests have to be listened to by city planners and by developers. Another area that really could be naturalized much more would be the cemeteries, and Toronto has dozens of them. Mount Pleasant is one that we're all familiar with as a place to go, and people do enjoy it as a place to walk. So it's while maintaining respect for the dead, of course, I think that cemeteries are a natural opportunity to do more with important and limited pieces of land, while Mount Pleasant does have some native trees. Much of its other plants are still things like exotic forsythia. And that's the kind of thing that could transition over time to become more native habitats. So there's lots of opportunity for conversations there. The use of native plants everywhere we get a chance, of course, is really important. Our pollinator populations, all our insects depend on native plants. And of course, the native plants have adapted to the kind of climate that we have, and they are reliable as well as being beautiful. So another thing, I've pointed this out already, but the recognizing that there are volunteers out there that are capable and willing to be trained and certified. That's a reality. The Toronto Nature Stewards is a nonprofit group that is like a new kid on the block, and they are doing terrific work in partnership again with the city, getting approval to care for patches of land in the ravines. And they this year had 23 sites. So you imagine 23 teams that are dedicated to caring for patches of land. And that's something that really could be expanded and is a way to go forward. So, I mean, in summary, really, I've presented some of the pressures that the city faces. We have construction cranes on in so many sites. We're a rapidly growing city, but we also have many restoration successes that we can learn from and be inspired by. And there's lots of opportunities for the future. We have a new city council, and there may be new approaches that they're willing to listen to. We know that these are some of the elements that we want to keep in mind. The use of native plants, the encouragement of volunteer groups to do the hands-on work. And if you want to know more, in fact, we have a talk. The Toronto Field Naturalists is hosting a Zoom talk next Sunday at 2:30 on unlocking the potential for funding new parkland in Toronto. So financing mechanisms that may work, including green bonds and other mechanisms. So if you're really keen, I definitely encourage you. It's a free Zoom next Sunday. And I want to thank all the artists and the volunteers, the photographers whose work has contributed to this talk. And so I'd be happy to chat a little bit with people now. There's been an introduced biological control, a beetle that has helped to control it. So it's not that it's really on its own sort of been reduced. There's been lots of activity to control it. And I think that with something like Phragmites or what people say is common reed, people are finding that if you can manage patches early on, if you can have a partnership with an agency and have the volunteers work with the agency, that is the best approach to handling big patches. So it can be daunting, but in fact, if you're interested in Phragmites, Sheila, in February, we have a whole panel discussion on weeding out Phragmites and what's working. So we have people from the Lake Huron area who have done remarkable work, and also a number of experts in the Toronto area. But it's a particularly challenging plant. There's doing nothing it really does mean that all the native vegetation disappears in those areas. So doing nothing is not really an option either. Very likely be best doing it with one of the small nonprofits, that doing it with the city directly. The city sort of has a sort of a third-party agreements with nonprofits. LEAF is a very good example. I think that St. Matt's got a little bit of funding from park people. There's really, again, a really rich ecosystem of groups. There is the Project Swallowtail in the western half of the city that supports pollinator gardens. And I mean, what I would often tell people is that, you know, for some of these little micro grants, like, don't even, like, it's going to cost you next to nothing. Just bring a bunch of volunteers together, do your research online. Money is not the impediment. It's not the barrier. If you've got the space and the land belongs to you, just go for it. You know, and experiment. You're going to have to experiment in any case. People often think, well, you know, this is going to be a great place, but it turns out it's the north side of the building, you know. The north side of the building might not be the place for a pollinator garden, right? You figure it out, live and learn. Yes, and I'd recommend the group called LEAF. So just do LEAF, all capitals, and Toronto. And that's a nonprofit group that is funded by the city, and they specialize in getting native trees into people's backyards and front yards. And they'll do a consultation as well. They'll bring people in and say, you know, where you're in your backyard, here's the kind of tree that would thrive, and this is the kind of tree you should really stay away from, you know, from size perspective, right? And so they will steer you right, and so I really recommend LEAF as being the group that would help you there.
Okay.
And it's really low cost. It's subsidized. I have spent an entire career at Queen's Park. I know that the full influence of municipal council at the City of Toronto, the mayor and everybody else in last council, all voted unanimously to say, Metrolinx, please, please, you know, don't cut Smalls Creek. Please pay attention. It was a unanimous, desperate request from the City of Toronto, including the mayor.
Nothing.
They went and clear cut Smalls Creek last February. So the entire ravine, okay, half the ravine. So the 6 trees in Osgood Hall is just you know, it's an afterthought. So it really, it is an incredibly frustrating situation, because without a change in government at Queen's Park, nobody is going to change the behavior of Metrolinx. Yeah. But let me take a different light on this, which is that working at the city level with the municipal council, there is a real receptivity to change and to doing the right thing. Of course, like every bureaucracy, there are times when, you know, they're slow, or, you know, there's, you know, they're feeling that there's, you know, they're kind of hapless, and not everything works perfectly, but there is a lot of goodwill, and councillors by large are on side, and you know, Mayor Tory is also can be convinced. So it's a completely different environment. If you say, we live in the city, we're going to work with city government to get as much greening as we can. It's amazing what can be done. There's an enormous amount we could do at the city level. There's lots and lots and lots to be optimistic about in the City of Toronto when it comes to restoring and growing our parkland. So I mean, we're going to have challenging questions to deal with. And maybe I'll just leave, because I think people want to, you know, get away. But let me just leave you with this thought here, which is that at the moment, the green belt is again at risk. Again, there's the potential that thousands of acres of greenland, green belt will be taken over by housing. And you've got everyone from Anne Golden to David Crombie to everybody saying, the city has the space, we can build up, we can build densely. And I've been saying that in this talk, we need to build densely, and yet we want nature too. And I think that circle can be squared, but the nature community also does need to be able to say, yes, we welcome housing, we welcome high rises. And that, you know, sometimes the nature community has some challenges getting their heads around that, to say, yes, we want people, more people. We want people in the ravines. We welcome them. We love people.